Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hope Hospice's Family Caregiver Education Series. I'm Debbie Emerson, Hope's Community Health Educator and Certified Dementia Specialist. And I am the facilitator of Hope's Family Caregiver Education Series. Okay, so I am pleased to introduce to you Michelle Shimamura, a licensed marriage and family therapist. Now, before going into private practice, Michelle worked as a grief support counselor at Hope Hospice, and that's where I met Michelle about 8 years ago. She has presented for us many times in the past, and I know you're going to get a lot out of her presentation. Now, in addition to being a marriage and family therapist, Michelle is a certified thanatologist. Thanatologists examine death and dying from multiple perspectives: medical, physical, psychological, spiritual, ethical. So certified thanatologists like Michelle work directly with people who are facing their own death or facing the death of a loved one. So Michelle's training and experience make her perfect for this presentation today.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie, and welcome everyone to this presentation. I'll be talking about two separate topics. One is pre-loss grief, and the second one is after the loss grief. And I know that this is a difficult topic to address, and I would love for our society and the world in general to be more inclusive about talking about the very human response to death of a loved one, which is grieving. And just know that grief is a highly personal and normal response to life-changing events. And it's a process that can lead to healing and personal growth. And that's a good thing. But it may take some time. So first of all is the pre-loss grief. This is the process of losing someone you love, and it can be very confusing and holding on to something while also letting go. It's a time where you maybe worry about your future, not knowing exactly what's going to happen, not knowing exactly what's going to happen to you, and it is, as I said, confusing. But also know that the person who is dying also may experience grief, and that's a grief of a different kind. That's more in line with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model, we lovingly call DAPTA, which is denial, anger, depression, I can't remember the rest of them, and acceptance eventually. And those were designed specifically for a person who has learned that they have a terminal condition. So as a caregiver, your grief may include all these four things at once, which also contributes to the feeling of being overwhelmed and also confusion. So what you've already lost, and it may be your day-to-day routine. It may be control over events or time, and for sure, it's a loss of control over your loved one's condition and illness. It's also a time where you're in the process of losing things, such as the witness of the decline, and that's a difficult thing to witness. I already mentioned the powerless to control it and distancing from your loved one. And honestly, sometimes this process also generates a little bit of anger, and that's perfectly normal, frustration, anger, and just know that that's normal, and make changes appropriately. Third thing that you might experience during pre-loss grief is what you might fear losing in the future: your socioeconomic status, milestones that you had looked forward to, weddings, the birth of grandchildren or children, graduations, anniversaries, trips. So those are things that you might lose in the future. Other things that you might lose is the future that you imagined or planned. awareness of your own fate or mortality, for example, and again, activities that maybe you had planned with your loved one. And then the last thing is freeing yourself from emotional ties with your loved one. And that's a difficult one because you don't want to let go. On the other hand, it's normal to go through that process of distancing yourself from your loved one. Okay. Pre-loss grief is normal. It's very real and can be overwhelming, as I've mentioned, because it can include any or all of the thoughts or feelings experienced during the grieving process that follows death. It's a very human reaction. So acknowledging your losses, allow yourself to acknowledge that although your loved one hasn't died, you are grieving. So try not to block it out or deny it. I have an example to give you. When my sister died, she died when she was 51 years old, and it was very, very sudden. She had a brain aneurysm that she had gone into surgery to repair. And during the recovery process, the nurses asked myself and her daughter, my niece, to go out and find some shoes that will correct a certain neurological reaction to the aneurysm. And we went all over trying, doing the best we could to find the shoes, thinking that she might be going into a nursing facility. It was just too threatening or hurtful to acknowledge that she was going to die. And the doctor told us that she very well may die. And certainly within two to 3 days, she did. And that was such a shock because we had blocked it out. We felt for sure that she would recover in some capacity, but she did not. So anyway, try not to block it out or deny it. Acknowledge what might be happening in the future, both to yourself and to your loved one. And know that grief can affect a person in various ways. And this pertains to both pre-loss grief as well as the post-loss grief. It can affect you physically. And that lists some of the ways that it can affect you physically. I would say that you know your body best. You feel it, you know it, even if you'd rather ignore it. It's important, as Debbie said, for self-care to pay attention to what your body is telling you. So even if you have a loss of appetite, try to find things that are nutritious, even if it's a small thing. Yesterday, I bought some tricolored carrots. I thought, wow, that's going to be fun. So I have a purple one, an orange one, and a yellow carrot, and that's what I'm going to eat. I mean, not all at the same time, but that's what I'll be eating. And it's nutritious, and it was a little bit fun. You might have sudden illness, aches, or pains. Grief very much can affect you physically in terms of illness and conditions. Headaches, unable to sleep. Sleep, I know, is an issue. And it's really important because this is the time when your body repairs itself from the abuse if it has experienced during the day. So it could be normal abuse, just eating maybe the wrong things or something that it doesn't like, or toxins and whatever's in your food and in your environment as well. So sleep is very important, not just for rest, but to repair your body. Give your body time to recover. Okay, a second way that grief may affect you is emotionally. And I think that's the one people generally understand. Anxiety, for sure. And I'll be giving you a grounding activity later that helps with anxiety, but also fear, anger, I mentioned, impatience, lack of focus or concentration. I know I had a client once upon a time whose husband was failing, his health was failing, and she had, helped him to the bathroom, and on their way back, she wanted to make sure that he wouldn't fall down, so she kind of grabbed his belt in the back, and he was not dealing with his health very well, and he lashed out at her and said something like, leave me alone, I can do this myself, and maybe he elbowed her or something. And in the course of that action, he fell and he broke a hip, and she felt extremely guilty. But she had also been impatient with him in that instance too. Another thing that can affect you emotionally in grieving is the lack of focus and concentration. Also guilt or regret, the shoulda, coulda, wouldas. Lack of focus and concentration sometimes can affect you in ways that you can't really focus on reading. You can't really watch anything on TV because you're not really there. You're not paying attention, you're not present. So just know that these are things that can affect you as you're grieving, and it's normal. And there are things that you can do to counteract that. All right, another way grief can affect you is socially, withdrawing from family or friends. I don't want to see anybody. Isolating yourself. I don't want to go anywhere. Or maybe you feel like you can't leave your loved one. But if you can find ways for friends or social services, whoever, if they're in hospice, there are volunteers who can watch your loved one for an hour or so. So isolating yourself both while you're in the process of caregiving and then after, when you're grieving, is it's really important, because isolating oftentimes just intensifies the grieving experience that you're having. So try to not isolate. Try to at least do something with someone that you trust occasionally. It may be difficult, maybe you don't feel like it, but there are ways that you can accept invitations for lunch and then just tell the person, I may not be up to it, I'll try, but if I can't, I'm just gonna let you know and leave. So try to watch the isolation. Okay. And then the final way that grief may affect you is spiritually. Oftentimes people will either abandon their faith, express anger at God, or sometimes it strengthens one's faith. There are also questions about, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my loved one? What's it all about? I call it, what's it all about, Alfie? But, why are we even here on earth? What's my purpose? And actually, when your loved one dies, that's another loss. I'll talk about that later, but that's another loss, is your caregiving responsibilities too. Leaves a big hole in addition to the hole that your loved one left. So spiritual questions are very, very common. Okay. Debbie mentioned self-care, and taking care of yourself is really important. Caregiving and grieving both take a lot of energy, and you won't be able to care for others if you don't care for yourself. I'm sure that Debbie and others have probably used the comparison to being on the airplane and the little oxygen masks drop down. You have to put yours on first before you can care for someone else. And it's a similar situation. You have to care for yourself before you can care for someone else. Yeah. So plan to carve out some time for yourself. It is healthy. Neglecting yourself can lead to depression and physical illness. Make time to go to your doctor, then don't skip the appointment. If it's at all possible to not skip the appointment. Sometimes things happen, life happens, but it's important at least once a year to have an annual checkup. And if little things are going wrong, have that checked up too, because you never know. And grief can affect you physically. So also caring for yourself involves eating clean, food that is nutritious, avoiding processed food, sugar, which is such an attraction, and enriched flour. drink lots of water, and avoid caffeine and alcohol. So when I say eating clean, before you put something in your mouth, take a look at it and say, is this nutritious or is it just filler? And I use Twinkies. I love Twinkies, but Twinkies are not nutritious. The carrots that I mentioned are, there are plenty of things you can get in the store nowadays that are nutritious, that are small, and you don't have to buy a whole lot of things just to keep yourself fed and eating nutritious food, along with water. Every time I go to the doctor, they ask, how many cups of water did you drink today? And I try to do my full 8, and that's important, both for you and your loved one as well. Okay. Continuing with self-care is resting when you can. I use deep breathing exercises for stress reduction, and I'll provide you an exercise of that in a little bit. And again, when you're feeling anxious or panicky, use a grounding activity, which only takes not even 5 minutes if you put your mind to it. So let's see. Oh, walking in nature. Nature heals. Nature knows grief. Any time of the year, if you're out in nature, you will see evidence of things that are dying and things that are new and growing. Spring is a natural time for growth, and winter seems to be a natural time for death, and fall as well. But if you look around, when you're in nature, you will see that there are things that are new and growing. So that's why I really emphasize being in nature. So if you can find respite from respite from caring for your loved one, see if you can carve out some time to walk in nature, even if it's in your own backyard or around the block in your neighborhood, and looking at, I don't know, the rosemary that's growing in somebody's front yard, or a tree or whatever. Just notice that and be in the present moment. And then at bedtime, think of 3 things that you were able to accomplish that day. It could be just getting out of bed, but there are at least 3 things. It's not necessarily a gratitude journal, although you could do that too, but just 3 things that you accomplished today. And it may bring a sense of self-worth for the day. Okay. The grounding activity. When you're feeling anxious, just look around, whether you're indoors or outside, and name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and one thing you love to taste, or one good thing about yourself. Now, what you can do, if you have time, is go outside, walk in nature, do some deep breathing, which I'm going to explain here in the next slide, and do the grounding activity. That's a trifecta of self-care. Don't worry about doing this in the order that's listed here. You can name 5 things that you can smell, or 4 things that you can touch. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that by doing this and focusing on what's around you, it brings you into the present moment and helps to give you a sense of wellness and relaxation. And you can do it 2 or 3 times. Absolutely, you can do this even in your mind. For example, sometimes when I'm having trouble going to sleep, I'm lying in bed and I'm thinking, I think I'll do the kitchen tonight. And just in my mind, I try to remember 5 things that I can see in my kitchen, 4 things that I can hear, and sometimes I have to cheat a little bit because I have to think, well, the garbage disposal, if it were on, was something I could hear. 3 things I could touch, that's easy, and I try to mix it up with texture, something smooth, something rough, something lovely, like a nice linen towel. 2 things I could smell. There's always all kinds of smells in the kitchen. And then one thing I love to taste, and I review what I've eaten that day and what one thing really made my tongue happy. And if I can't come up with anything, then there's one good thing about myself. And the one good thing about myself could be doing this grounding activity for self-care. And you can repeat, it's okay. It really is, I think, one of the best activities to help with anxiety, panic, stress. All right, deep breathing. This is called 478 deep breathing, and I stole it from Andrew Weil, Dr. Weil. And if you Google it, you'll find it on there. He provides a little bit more information about it, but this is one of the best deep breathing activities that I have found. And there are many, many deep breathing types. So this one asks you to sit with your back straight and then put the tip of your tongue against that ridge of tissue just behind your upper front teeth and keep it there throughout the activity. And what this does is invoke the vagus nerve, which goes throughout your body, and you can Google that as well. So that while you're doing the deep breathing, you're telling the vagus nerve it's time to relax. And it sends that message throughout your body. Okay, while your tongue is in position, then you exhale completely through your mouth, making a whoosh. You don't have to do the whoosh if you don't want to. And then inhale through your nose to a count of 4. And it's your count, not any particular count. It's your count, however you want to count it, whatever frequency. And then hold your breath for a count of 7. Again, your own count. And then exhale completely through your mouth to a count of 8. That's the 4-7-8 part. And then you can repeat that cycle 3 more times. And you can do the grounding activity as well. If I were with you there in person, we could practice, but I think you get the idea, is to breathe in through your nose, hold it, and then exhale through your mouth. And do that 4 times. I did that kind of fast, but healthy grieving. It's one of my favorite quotes. You don't heal from loss because time passes. You heal because of what you do with that time. So here are some things that you can do that will help with the grieving. People you feel comfortable talking to. There are people who can listen and don't offer advice or tell you what you should do, or, oh, that's horrible, don't do that, or how can you do that? You want to feel comfortable around someone that you can vent with what's going on in your head, what's going on in your life at that moment. Another thing is nice things I can do for myself, and for each person that would be different. Sometimes what I think of, and it may sound silly, but I go to the party store and they have an aisle of paper plates and napkins and stuff. And some of the napkins are really, colorful. So I'll pick out a pack of napkins that bring me joy, to quote Marie Kondo, but some paper napkins that bring me joy. And I bring those home, and that's what I use when I'm eating healthy food. So that's something nice. But it could be a pedicure. It could be anything that you think is nice for yourself. Taking a walk, that's really nice for yourself. Ways to express what you're feeling, however that is for you. Some people are really good at art. Some people are really good at writing. There's movement and talking. So whatever method you find the best for you to express yourself, try to do that. And it doesn't have to be a whole art session. It could just be a little sketch pad and you're sketching on what you're feeling. This represents what I'm feeling today. Okay, ways to increase your energy when you're feeling low. Drinking a glass of water, eating something nutritious, going for a walk. Those are all things to increase your energy. Ways to get the right amount of sleep. It may be taking a nap in the afternoon. Nutritious food, I've already discussed, I think. And Oh, healthy restaurant meals that you can order takeout. Now, that sounds odd, healthy restaurant meals, but there are some out there. I know every time I go to Chipotle and get a chicken taco, I lose weight, but it's mostly, for me anyway, tomatoes, lettuce, the chicken, which is protein, and a little bit of cheese, not too much, but you can add black beans, which are healthy and full of protein as well. So there can be, not exactly a restaurant, but there are meals that you can order and have takeout or delivered as well. Reflecting on the remaining time. What you want may not always be possible, so do your best to spend your remaining time together in a way you and your loved one find meaningful. So you may want to tie up loose ends, and you may not want to do all these things at the same time. Make amends for forgiving or any real or presumed injuries on both sides. Review your life together, what you've learned, what was joyful. Review practical matters or tasks that you will be taking over for your loved one. One of my clients, whose loved one was in hospice, together they created a binder with tabs for various tasks that she would be taking over. So it included perhaps websites with passwords, contacts, call so-and-so for plumbing, and here's his name or her name, and here's the phone number. Taxes, who does our taxes, and this is what you need to get together, and that sort of thing. So there were various tabs for each of these activities or tasks that the surviving loved one would be taking over. And then also discuss funeral, burial, cremation arrangements, and do the best you can to honor their wishes. Sometimes it doesn't work out. It depends on the family and the traditions and that sort of thing. I know when my father-in-law died, he didn't want anything. I don't want anything. But that wasn't possible for the tradition. So there was a small family ceremony. And as my mother said, I won't be there, so do whatever you want. Okay, we'll do that. But try to honor their wishes, however that is, even if it's the care of their remains, whether they want to be buried, whether they want to be cremated, whether they wanted to be part of compost for trees, which is a possibility. You can do that. There are many ways. Even if your loved one is unconscious or very near the end of life, express your love and let him or her know how much he or she will be missed and how much your relationship has meant. You can give them permission to pass, depends on the stage and how close to end of life they are. You can give them permission to pass, assuring them that you will be okay. And my father-in-law was in the hospital actually, and he was very terminal, very close to end of life. And he was pretty much sleeping constantly, which, happens. That's okay. And so my husband, his son, was giving him this message to permission to pass and that sort of thing. And when he was finished, the father-in-law sat up in bed and he said, "Let's go home." And I looked at my husband and he looked at me and I said, "I don't think he's talking about his house in Hayward. I think he's talking about the other side." It's very interesting how end-of-life experiences take place, and many people in hospice and other caregiving situations can tell you that oftentimes there are what could be called hallucinations. I don't think they're hallucinations, but loved ones who have passed before who come to visit and help them cross over. So I think that's what my father-in-law was talking about. Let's go home. Home is actually a common word for the other side. Okay. Ira Byock has suggested 4 things to share with your loved one that matter most for loving and dying well. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. And then I added this fifth one. I'll miss you. Feeling relief is normal. It's a normal human reaction. There's no need to feel guilt. You did nothing wrong intentionally. Maybe as you review things, you thought, oh, I should have done that. I should have done this, or I shouldn't have done that. And I think that it's important to know that you did the best you could under the circumstances and what you knew at the time. Now, 15 minutes later, you might have done something different. A day later, you might have done something different. But in the moment, at that time, you did the best you could. So be gentle with yourself. You did nothing wrong intentionally. And relief doesn't mean that you love the person any less. I mentioned it takes a lot of energy to care for someone. And so when they eventually pass, of course, your caregiving activities end, and there can be a sense of relief. Who, at least he's not suffering anymore, that sort of thing. So it's normal. And keep in mind, another of my favorite quotations, we are not human beings trying to be spiritual, but rather we are spiritual beings trying to be human. Boy, that takes a lot of pressure off my shoulders, because I think, wow, I really was trying to do the best I could. But I'm just a spiritual being trying to be human, and all humans are flawed in some way. So again, be gentle with yourself. And know that grief will happen. Pre-loss grief will neither mitigate nor amplify your post-death grieving process. You will grieve in your own way. Be sure to honor your grief and be gentle with yourself. So the grieving process for after-death loss is very similar to the pre-loss grieving process. And I know that many of you are not here yet, but just kind of tuck away this information and keep it for the future. And also know that there are no stages or steps to grieving. It is not a linear process, but it's very organic. So I'll show you a graphic in a minute that demonstrates that very idea. Okay, so grieving after loss is very similar to the pre-loss grief. But there are some differences. So one of them is realizing the finality of the death, its permanence. You can't go back and ask them, where did you put the certain heirloom that we had in our family? Because I can't find it. Where is it? It's permanent. You can't do that. And it sounds silly, but it's true. You do realize, oh, this is very permanent. Also, assuming new roles or losing other roles. I've talked about that. Facing paperwork and the frustrations of doing so. I've talked to so many people who just can't even deal with all the paperwork that's involved, providing death certificates to certain institutions or organizations, companies. Some of them want an original, some of them will take a Xerox copy, and trying to keep all that straight and getting it done is frustrating. So that happens. Also, another thing that isn't talked about too much are subscriptions. I know, again, when my father-in-law died, well, actually, I had a client whose wife died, and he didn't know what to do with all the catalogs and magazines that were coming in. So I told him about this little part in the front of the magazine that told you how to contact a certain company. And I said, just do a few a day, maybe even one, and just call them and tell them that you're canceling the subscription or you're canceling the catalog or whatever, and get that done. The other thing, I mentioned my father-in-law, he had been a volunteer fireman in his younger years and subscribed to some fireman magazine. So we kept getting it, and it made my husband a little sad, just remembering all the nice times that his father was a volunteer fireman, and knowing that he was gone. So I called them one day and said, he has died and we need to cancel this magazine. And he said, oh, he was a volunteer fireman. Yes. He says, oh, he said, let me look that up. And he took his name and he said, oh, there's a little life insurance policy for his family. And I said, oh, swell. We didn't know. So you never know what's going to happen. But yeah, that's part of the frustrations of paperwork, are the magazines and the catalogs that keep coming. And it's just a constant reminder. If you don't need them, then cancel them. Another difference is the unexpected trajectory. It takes as long as it takes for you to grieve. There's no rule book. There's no timeline for sure. Well, for most people, it's more than 2 weeks. I've been told that it can take an average of up to 5 years to fully integrate a loss. And again, it's different for everybody. It can be shorter or longer. This is an average. When I experienced the death of my sister, it was 4 years. And I didn't even know that I was still kind of in it. But I was at work one day sitting at my desk, and I looked up, and suddenly, and it sounds like a movie, but suddenly it was like a veil had lifted. And I said, oh, where have I been the last 4 years? And I was able then to kind of move forward and do what I needed to do. Also, guilty thoughts sometimes happen after death loss. This next graphic I love. On the left side are the perceived stages of grief. And it starts with the loss, and it goes down into shock and numbness and denial. Some of the things we've talked about: fear, guilt, isolation, loneliness, depression. And it starts going up for recovery, new patterns, hope, affirmations, helping others, and adjusting to the loss. It doesn't work that way. That's the more realistic experience of grief. So you have the same kind of emotions and thoughts, but they're all over the map. And it can be overwhelming. And people say that they think they're going crazy. You're not, you're just grieving. But that's more realistic. It just goes all over the place. And sometimes when you think, oh, I'm doing well, and then there's a trigger of some sort. I know I was stopped at a stoplight once upon a time, and there was a car who pulled up on my right side. And I noticed that at the door handle of the car, there were 5 little numbers that you had to press in with your, I guess, PIN code, so that you can unlock the car and get in the car. Well, that's a simple thing, but my sister had a car like that. And when I saw that, it just brought it all back. And I had a little tear or two. And there I was, just sitting in traffic, and see this car, and who knows, there's triggers all over the place. So just know that when you see a trigger, you might get a reaction, and that's okay. I have a book that talks, the whole book is about grieving and guilt, but I've tried to narrow it down to things that I thought might be most important for us. And so here are some types of grief. They're not all inclusive, but causing death, whether it's intentional or by neglect. Role, what should I have done that I didn't do? What didn't I see? The if I only did this, or if only I hadn't done that. Relief, we talked about relief. Guilt, what would a perfect grieving process be like? Am I doing it right? I can't tell you how many times someone will come into my office and say, so, I've experienced this death, this loss, and I think I'm grieving, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. Am I doing this right? Well, there is no right way. There's just your way. And there's no steps I mentioned. It's very organic. So however that is for you, I tell people, if you're not hurting yourself or you're hurting other people, it's all right. I had a client whose parent died, and she read mystery novels just voraciously, book after book after book. And after about a year, she said, okay, I'm done. And that was her grieving process. So, or on the other hand, she quit reading and launched into a more traditional grieving process. So, all right. So just remember, there's no right way necessarily. And recovery guilt, living life in a new normal without the loved one and feeling okay about moving forward. this may not apply to you. In fact, none of these may apply to you, but these are some that I thought might be pertinent for us. So I think it's important to think realistically about your guilt. So it's one of those things that I mentioned about doing the right thing you did the right thing based on what you knew at the time. You did the best you could. So ask if you could have known really about X, Y, or Z, and why didn't I do X, Y, or Z? And I could have stopped X, Y, and Z. I just recently had a client who was profoundly saddened by something that happened that caused the death. And she felt like she could have stopped it, but she didn't know at the time. She didn't know that a certain thing was going to happen. So yeah, that kind of leads into the next one, which is I should have X, or I shouldn't have done X. And then just realize that hindsight is wisdom. You did the best you could with what you knew at the time. And again, that can change from moment to moment. Okay, William Worden is one of the premier researchers in grief. And he has written several books, but the most recent one fine-tuned his 4 tasks of mourning. So one is to accept the reality of loss, and that one's a hard one, and that can go on for a long time. In fact, I think when my sister died, and it was very, very shocking, it was hard for me to accept the reality of the loss. I mean, on one side, intellectually, I knew that she was dead and this was going to happen and so on. But on the other side, it was really hard emotionally to accept the reality of loss. So one thing that helped me was I just imagined that she was like in, I don't know, Bulgaria or someplace, Mongolia, and she was without any form of communication, no cell phones, no phones, no nothing. And that she was just there. And that kind of made me feel okay, that she was still there, but she was just somewhere that was incommunicado. Well, I thought for a long time that I must be crazy for thinking that. That's just not healthy, until Prince Harry, had written about when his mother died. And he said the same thing. He said, I knew that she was dead, but for me, I placed her somewhere else where she couldn't communicate with us, and that was okay. And I thought, well, thank you, Harry. At least 2 of us are thinking those thoughts. So it helped with acceptance of the reality of the loss. And through time, I let go of that. And I think through time, Harry will do the same thing. All right, the second task is to process the pain of grief. We talked about that, the physical, emotional, behavioral, spiritual, and adjusting to a world without your loved one. That's what we call creating a new normal. It also can include continuing bonds. So maybe your loved one isn't here physically, but you can create continuing bonds. And that is, well, I guess sort of having my sister in Mongolia is a continuing bond, at least for a while. But you can write to them. You can speak to them. People I asked, they have photos of their loved one in the house, and I say, well, do you talk to them? Oh, absolutely. I said, well, good. That's healthy. And you can talk out loud. You don't have to just imagine. You can imagine, but you can talk out loud. I have a picture of my sister on my dresser, and when I pass by, I tap it on the top of the frame, as if I were tapping her on the head and saying, hello, how are you? So there are all sorts of things that you can do in continuing bonds with your loved one. Some people have trinkets or clothing that they keep close to them or sleep with. That's okay. It's a continuing bond. It's all right. And then the fourth task of mourning, according to Worden, is to find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of your journey through life. Life goes on. It may seem rude, but it does. And so it's important to proceed with your life. And, some people will say, well, is that what your loved one would want you to do? Yeah. Finding an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life, keeping them with us, but still going on with life. And so when I have clients whose spouse has died and they're kind of moving forward with their life, and maybe they met someone, I try to warn them, you're not just in a relationship with this new person, you still have a relationship with your other person, and please make sure that you discuss this with your new person. It's always going to be there. It just is. And depending on who the new person is, you may find that it's easier to talk about your loved one who died, or not so much. So it's up to you in that relationship, but just know that there's a third person in that relationship. But do what brings you comfort. That's the important thing. And one of the things you can do is make a list sometime. Well, what if I lost? And it could, for sure, it's the loved one that you've lost, but there are other things that you've lost. You've lost connection with certain people that were maybe closer to your loved one than with you. Certain talents that maybe your loved one had that you don't have. So just think about the things that you've lost. And then in a second column, think about, well, what are the things that I can keep? What do I still have going on for me? Maybe you're great at gardening. You still have that. And maybe you have grandchildren or children. You still have that. So these are some things that you can keep. And then in a third column, you can talk about, well, what's my future? What's in my future? What do I want to do now? What's something I've always wanted to do that maybe I can do now? What's in your future? Maybe I have more time to garden. Maybe I'd like to get a crepe myrtle that your husband always hated, but you always liked it. So, there are many things that you, if you think about it, that you could do now. Continuing bonds. So, yeah, you can talk to them either in your head or out loud. I suggest that if you write letters to them, use the longhand. Don't use your computer. Get a pen or pencil and a piece of paper and write to them, because something interesting happens, especially if you're in a relaxed state. Something like in your gut, in your soul, rises up from your chest down through your arm and your hand and into the pen. And it's not exactly automatic writing, but sometimes it connects with your subconscious. So you can say things to your loved one that maybe you hadn't really thought about. And then when you sit back and look at it, you think, wow, where did that come from? Keep photos of your loved one around. Include them in special events or holidays. I think last year before, there was a movie about Elvis. My sister loved Elvis. She probably had more than one regret, but one of her big regrets was that she never saw him in person. But she loved Elvis. So I went to see the film out of curiosity, but also as sort of a tribute to my sister. So it's kind of a continuing bond for me, was to watch this film about Elvis and reminisce about how she idolized him at the time. So that was interesting. But you can include your loved one into holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving. For some families, it's July the 4th, and maybe family reunions and picnics and that sort of thing. So depending on your family and the situation, you can include them. You can either have a place at the table for them, or you can propose a toast in their honor before you eat, or have a candle, or if you want to do something more subtle, you can just do something quietly. I had a client whose mother died, and she was having a really hard time with it, and was going away for Christmas and she was visiting her in-laws, and she didn't feel like it was appropriate so much to honor her mother at this particular event. So I said, well, you can do something quiet yourself, and take a candle, and on Christmas Eve you can light the candle and have a special poem or a special letter that you've written to her or something. And she did that, and it worked out really well. So there are many different things you can do to include your family member into special events and holidays. Even at my nephew's wedding, he was my sister's son. Even at my nephew's wedding, he included, a mention of her in the wedding. And I thought, well, that's nice. Take a trip that they wanted to take. I did have a client once whose husband died, and they had planned this trip and had already paid for it, and he died. But she said, you know what, I'm going to go anyway. So she went with, I don't know, a friend or somebody, and she made these little photos that were anyway, they were treated. And while she was on the trip, she would place them in not so obvious places, maybe between two stones or something, and left photos of her loved ones so that he could be with her on this trip. And I thought that was so lovely. And you don't even have to take a trip to do that. You could just do that as you visit places that were special to you. So planning for anniversaries and holidays. The key word there is planning. Many times people, as certain holidays approach, face them with fear and dread. But if you plan for them, and there's a whole hour's worth of information about that I could share, but again, the key word is planning. Plan to do something for yourself, or consciously plan not to do something if that's too much. But plan for it. Don't just think, oh, it's going to be horrible. And I will tell you that in groups I've had through time, people have come back after the holidays and said, it wasn't as bad as I thought. It just wasn't. And they planned. So plan. Enjoying food that they loved. That's another way to have a continuing bond, again, at family celebrations or just for yourself. And then also you can enjoy food that you loved, but they didn't. There was one couple who the man didn't like tuna, but she loved tuna. So started eating tuna. And then be open to signs from your loved one. And this is very spiritual. So you may connect with this or not, but some find pennies from heaven. I know, I went back, well, my family's in the Midwest, but I went back there to settle some financial things with my brother. And as I had exited the bank, I was getting into my car and I looked down and there was a penny. Now I know that penny wasn't there when I got out of the car, but it was there when I got into the car, and I just picked it up and I said, thank you, Mom. Dragonflies seem to be connected with death in some way. Butterflies. My mom loved butterflies. Hummingbirds. You can put up a hummingbird feeder. Feathers. One person, I can't remember now why, after her loved one died, she kept finding feathers in the oddest places, and she put them all together, and it sort of formed a special place for her. Heart-shaped stone. There was another woman who, everywhere she went, she seemed to find these heart-shaped stones, so she collected them. And then another continuing bond that I experienced was a friend of mine. His name was Tom, and we had been friends for a long, long time, and he lived way on the East Coast, but at the time. But one of the things Tom loved was girl groups. He was about my age, so girl groups were big when we were teens. And so he had died, and I was out shopping with my niece, about 2 weeks later or so. I don't remember exactly. And in the store, they started playing girl group music. And I thought, this is really weird, because they hardly ever play girl group music. It may be oldies, but not girl groups. So I got a little choked up, and I said, thank you, Tom. I hear you and I see you. So just be open to that if you can. Everyone grieves differently. I think that's important to know. And there was that question about families, about siblings. which I know is a little bit different, but just know that everybody grieves differently. And there are 8 different factors that influence this grieving process, and I'll go over them in a minute. But there's a film that speaks to this. It's called 2 Weeks. I don't know if you can find it anymore. These are the days when they had videos and you could go rent them, but it's called 2 Weeks, and Sally Field is in it, and she has a terminal illness, and she has 4 adult children. And the reason I recommend it is that in the movie, all 4 children react to her impending death differently, and then as they grieve differently. And some of them could be angry, and some of them can be combative, and some of them are the peacemakers. But I thought the film, I don't think that was the purpose of the film, but the film did a really good job of demonstrating that. So the relationship you had with your loved one, whether it was close relationship or an estranged relationship, whether you had a secure or insecure attachment to the loved one, whether you were dependent on the loved one. I found out I was dependent on my sister. Who knew? I didn't know until she was gone. Whether it's ambivalent or conflicted. All of these can influence your grieving process. The second one is the nature of the death. Was it a lingering long-term death? Was it unexpected? Was it violent? All of these can influence your grieving process. Also, your personality and how you cope. Are you more extroverted or introverted? Do you like to solve problems? Are you patient or impatient? Are you a thinker or are you active? Are you anxious or are you confident? Whatever your personality is, especially how you cope and how you've coped in the past, can give you a roadmap for that aspect of grieving. And then your physical health, whether you are physically active, you can that helps with your grieving process, getting out in nature, doing something active, that sort of thing. Also, what phase of life you're in. Grieving can affect people very differently when you're an adolescent or even a child, and adolescent. If you're a parent, whether you're an empty nest, whether you're retired. So your age and gender can influence that. Your priorities, what's important when you're an adolescent, maybe education and work is more important than grieving somebody, or your friends are more important. But when you're an empty nest or retired, those priorities are very different. And your thoughts on life and death can also influence your grieving process too. So your life circumstances, finances, residence, job, are there children present? Those things can affect your grieving process. I know that when I have worked with women whose husband died and they were very young, and so she had little kids in the house, so she just really backburnered her grief because she felt she had to take care of the children, and she felt like she had to be, in all ways present for them. And I understand that as a parent, but that's very different than someone, for example, who's retired. It'd be very different. Also, your support system, whether it's absent or you have one, whether people are safe or are they directive? Are they going to tell you what you should do, what you shouldn't do? And then that includes family, friends, and your faith. So in the end, do what brings you comfort. Be around the people who give you comfort. And then also your spiritual beliefs, which I've talked about a little. Making sense of the death, of the situation. Why did my loved one die? Why is this happening to me? Why now? Again, it depends on your phase of life, for example. So you put all these factors together and you can see why everybody is going to be grieving differently, even children in the same family. 8 things a grieving person should know. You're not alone. Every thought, feeling, and behavior is normal. As long as it's not illegal or self-destructive. Crying is a gift. And did you know that there's 3 different kinds of tears? chemically. There are tears from grief and sadness, tears of joy and happiness, and the tears you get, for example, when you're cutting an onion. Documented evidence, all three tears chemically contain different components. So crying is a gift. Also, you remain a lovable person even when you're confused and feeling like you're going crazy. Honor your feelings, all of them, because grief is not one emotion but many, which we have seen in the graphic. And then people are uncomfortable with grieving, so be sure to find someone who can be there with you without judgment or directives. And no matter how bad you feel, you will survive. You can carry your wound through life, or you can find ways to heal. And grief is exhausting, from disruption, poor sleep, poor diet, demands of all kinds, self-doubt. If it may seem as if there's no peace, so you need to create your own peace. Do some deep breathing, do some grounding activities. And then grief never really goes away. It does evolve over time into manageable thoughts and memories and feelings. That's why it's important, so much of what you do while you're grieving is important. Not just, letting it kind of wash over you and thinking, oh, I wish someone could wave a magic wand and make this all go away. It's really up to you to do activities and do some forward thinking and maybe some self-reflection and some physical movement and all these things together. You are in control of your grieving process. So I wanted to leave with a poem. And the poem is this one. There's another poem too. They're both equally valuable, but this one I wanted to use today. It's one I lifted from one of Louise Penny's book, The Cruelest Month, but I thought it was so poignant. I love it. Loss was like that. You didn't just lose a loved one, you lost your heart, your memories, your laughter, your brain, and it even took your bones. Eventually, it all comes back, but different, rearranged. And that is so true. Those are some of the things that you've lost. Your memories, your laughter, your brain. Yeah, so, all right. Questions?
So the first question is, any recommendations for working with siblings regarding the completion of the deceased estate? So Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the only thought I had was the one I mentioned, was everybody grieves differently, and know that, and don't be, if you can, try not to be so judgy, because everyone's different. It depends on the situation, and to me, it's screaming legal, legal, legal. So I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. And again, it depends on the situation, but I know that sometimes when a parent dies and they have adult children, the adult children don't necessarily always agree on how things should be.
I always think that sometimes it's hard when you have one person who's been kind of the primary caregiver, throughout, the end of life, and then once the person passes, that's the person who has all the info, may have copies of the wills and, the living trust and those types of things. But if there's other siblings, everybody, and this I think is just human nature, everybody likes to feel like they're a part of something. And in particular, if we're looking at an estate and dealing with that, not only do people want to feel like they're part of the decision-making process, but they also want to make sure there's some transparency. Because people can, especially when it comes to money, people can get kind of paranoid about things and, be questioning, what the primary caregiver kind of is doing. So I think it's always important, number one, to be absolutely transparent with everything you do, even though it takes an extra step. And it's like, just send an email, send a text, do a phone call, let all the siblings know exactly what's going on. But almost as importantly, try to give everybody who's willing to help a task that they can do. Now, if you're one of those people that's like me and I'm a control freak and I want to do everything myself because, of course, I think I can do everything better than everybody else, which is completely bogus and ridiculous, but there you go. Um, but find, some type of a task that you feel that that person, could handle. They could possibly even excel at, because giving somebody something to do makes them feel like they're part of this process of closure, because that's what dealing with the estate and dealing with the financial aspects is a part of the closure process, in dealing with somebody's death. So that's my probably more than 2 cents worth of on all of that.